If you've played SpaceCraft for a while, you've probably noticed that the game starts simple, but becomes significantly more demanding as you progress. This was exactly where I made several mistakes early on, until I began to better understand some mechanics that the game doesn't explain very clearly. So in this video, I want to share 10 advanced tips that helped me throughout my playthroughs, and which might make your life much easier as well. I'm Matthew, and let's get started. There is a lie we tell ourselves in every space game, that the planet's surfaces are where the real gold is. In SpaceCraft, I spent a good amount of time in this illusion, mining crust after crust, thinking I was doing the right thing, until the day I decided to stop ignoring those asteroid belts scattered across the map. It was there that I discovered that the game, in fact, hides the real treasures in completely different places. The difference in wealth is absurd. The crust of most planets simply doesn't compete with what you find floating out there. Asteroid belts are infinitely denser in rare elements, the resources that really make the difference when unlocking high-end technologies or building advanced components. When you start extracting from them, you realize you spent most of your time hitting common rocks while the real loot was orbiting right in front of you. What makes it even better is how you can approach this. Instead of staying stuck there manually, you can create mobile mining stations and leave them working on their own. While your main ship goes to take care of other missions, expand the map, or solve some trouble, these stations remain there, collecting valuable resources without you needing to keep an eye on them. It's like having an extra operational arm that never stops. Since I shifted my focus to the asteroids, my economy in the game stopped being that constant struggle for basic materials. Today, I look at planetary surfaces as a secondary place and give real attention to what is floating in space. If you are still avoiding the belts thinking they are just scenery, you are leaving the majority of the game's wealth behind. When you start building well-thought-out modular ships with a clear focus on exploration, cargo, or efficiency, it becomes much more than a vehicle. It becomes a product. And that's where the blueprints come in. At first, I only built ships for myself, testing here and there, but when I understood that I could save these designs and sell them on the market, it changed everything. Because every detail matters: weight distribution, module placement, balance between range and consumption. When you nail that design, other people basically pay to skip the trial and error process you already went through. And there is a very strong detail in this. You can also buy blueprints from other players, so it really becomes an ecosystem. Sometimes you need a well-optimized heavy freighter, and instead of wasting hours designing it, you simply invest in a ready-made blueprint and move on with the game. This speeds up your progress immensely, especially in the phases where every decision carries weight. Today, I see this almost as passive income within the game. You create good designs once, put them on the market, and they continue to generate returns while you are doing other things. It's a very intelligent way to take advantage of the game's modular system and turn knowledge into profit. If you are still only selling ore, you are leaving easy money on the table. If there is one thing that completely changes how you play SpaceCraft, it's when you stop thinking like a pilot and start thinking like a true interplanetary system manager. At the beginning, manually flying back and forth between planets, hauling ore yourself, feels fine. But there comes a time when this simply bottlenecks your progress. The big turning point happens when you start using drones and freighters strategically. This isn't just a convenience. The game was clearly designed for this. You create routes, automate transport, and suddenly that constant flow of resources begins working for you, even while you are doing something completely different. And here is the most interesting part. When you master this logistics, the game stops being just exploration and becomes almost a living system. Your planets and moons start connecting like a production chain. One place extracts, another refines, another manufactures. And all of this happens without you needing to pilot a ship back and forth the entire time. In practice, this means more time focusing on what really matters: expanding, optimizing, and exploring new possibilities. So if you are still stuck with manual transport, seriously, you are playing a limited version of the game. Automation isn't just an advanced tip, it is essentially the step that transforms your SpaceCraft experience. One of the most underrated features, but one that can completely save your gameplay, is this transition between space and planet surfaces without a loading screen. At first, it just seems like a nice technical detail until you realize that this is, in fact, a survival tool. There were several situations where I was exploring a hostile area, starting to get surrounded, and the fastest exit wasn't to fight, it was simply to take off. The fact that there is no loading whatsoever makes everything much more fluid. You leave the surface, break through the atmosphere, and are in space in seconds, without that pause that would normally leave you vulnerable. And the opposite works just as well. If you are in space and identify a mining node or something valuable on a dangerous planet, you can go straight in, quickly, without interruption, almost like a surprise attack. This completely changes how you approach risk, because you know you always have a much more dynamic entry and exit route. This makes the game feel much more tactical than it seems at first glance. It's not just about exploring, it's about knowing when to enter, and most importantly, when to leave. This fluid transition becomes almost instinctual after a while, something you use all the time without even noticing, but which makes all the difference in the most intense situations. Modularity here isn't just about aesthetics or organization, it's about survival. When you start separating each part well, cargo, propulsion, scientific systems, everything starts to make much more sense. I realized this in the most painful way possible, taking damage and seeing the entire ship compromised because of a single problem. Once you adopt a modular structure, this type of situation stops being a total disaster. If something breaks, you only lose that module, not the entire operation. And there is a very strong strategic side to this as well. You can build specialized ships depending on what you want to do. Going mining, focus on cargo and efficiency. Exploring, invest in sensors and mobility. Entering a dangerous area, reinforce structure and propulsion. This flexibility gives every ship a clear purpose. Ultimately, playing with modularity is almost like building an intelligence system rather than just flying a ship. You start thinking about design, redundancy, and optimization. And when it clicks, it gives a very satisfying sense of control, because even when something goes wrong, you still have a way to recover without losing everything. If there is one turning point I took too long to notice, it's that the economy isn't just yours, it's everyone's. The game has a player-driven structure where everything you do affects the market, and trying to be self-sufficient in everything is basically choosing the hardest and slowest path possible. When you join forces with other players and form a corporation, things change completely. Suddenly, you can focus on monopolizing specific high-level resources, dominating profitable trade routes, and dividing logistics intelligently. Instead of each person trying to do a bit of everything, you specialize, optimize, and scale much faster. The most interesting part is seeing how this influence builds naturally. If your corporation controls a rare resource or a strategic route, well, you start to dictate prices and availability. This creates real market power that a solo player simply cannot reach, no matter how much time they play alone. And I'm not just talking about money. Shared logistics make large-scale operations viable. Transporting huge cargoes, defending mining areas, expanding to distant systems. All of this becomes easier when you have an organized structure behind you. In the end, SpaceCraft rewards those who think in terms of networks, and building a strong corporation is the step that transforms your experience from solitary survival into a true space empire. There was a base I built early on that simply shut down during the planetary night. I had generators, I thought everything was fine, but when the cycle shifted, the power ran out before the sun rose again. I lost production, some systems locked up, and that taught me that in SpaceCraft, having power isn't just about turning machines on, it's about sustaining them when the main source disappears. The big turning point came when I stopped placing generators scattered around the base and started centralizing everything. Having an organized generation point makes maintenance much easier, but what matters most is what you put around that core. Setting up battery banks to act as an emergency reserve completely changes the reliability of your operation. Instead of relying directly on what is being generated that second, you create a network that breathes, absorbing the surplus and releasing it when it's really needed. What I do now is think about the complete cycle. During the day, whether solar or any other source, the base needs to generate more than it consumes. This surplus goes straight to the batteries. When night falls, and it always does, the base starts to drain those reserves. If you calculated correctly, you wake up with spare charge and no interruptions. And look, it's not just about avoiding a blackout. When the power is stable, the efficiency of the entire base increases because you don't have voltage drops that restart processes or freeze production. After I adopted this system, building bases in SpaceCraft became a different experience. Today, the first thing I plan isn't where the refinery or storage will be, it's where the electrical heart will be and how many batteries I need to get through the entire night comfortably. It seems bureaucratic to talk about power management, but it is the kind of thing that separates a functioning base from a base that keeps having problems. There is something painful to see in SpaceCraft. You spend hours setting up a perfect refinery, putting everything in the right places, and then you realize that the machines spend more time idle than working. I personally took a while to understand that the problem wasn't the factory itself, but the path the resource took to get there. When I looked closely, I saw bottlenecks everywhere, inventories full waiting for someone, or rather me, to become the mill hand and push the material forward. The turning point came when I stopped treating extraction and production as two separate areas and started thinking about a single continuous line. Instead of extracting to a depot, then loading, then taking it to the refinery, I simply connected everything directly. Connecting extractors directly to factories using conveyors and pipes eliminated that dead time that was killing my efficiency. In practice, this means that the ore leaves the ground and enters the production line without needing an intermediate step. And when you see those refineries working nonstop without being idle waiting for raw materials, you realize that the entire game shifts pace. The throughput goes up, you process faster, and the base stops being an accumulator of idle resources and becomes a real machine. Since I adopted this logic, I can no longer set up a factory any other way. The feeling of seeing a constant, uninterrupted flow is addictive. And the best part is that you start applying this to everything: production, assembly, even logistics between bases. If you are still moving resources manually from one point to another, seriously, you are missing a huge part of what SpaceCraft has to offer. You know that feeling of having everything ready, ship prepared, destination plotted, and then suddenly you realize you forgot something basic? It was like that for me at the beginning. I was so focused on engine power and cruising speed that I simply left radiation shielding aside. The result, I entered an intense nebula thinking the problem would be hostile ships, and I almost lost the entire fleet to something that wasn't even firing at me. What the game doesn't yell behind your back, but definitely charges you for later, is that traveling through dangerous areas isn't just a matter of having fuel to get there. Radiation is practically a silent enemy. Your engines may be at maximum, tanks full, but if the shielding doesn't keep up, you are simply racing toward a chaos of failing systems and crew suffering continuous damage. And it's not just the main ship. The entire fleet suffers if you ignore this. That's why today I have two sacred rules before leaving any base: full tanks and verified shielding. I keep fuel reserves not just for the trip there, but for the return and for unforeseen events. And I never ever underestimate fleet protection. That shielding that seems like overkill in safe areas becomes the difference between life and death when you cross a radiation field or a region near an unstable sun. In the end, managing fuel and radiation is what transforms a risky exploration into a reliable operation. When you stop treating this as a detail and start seeing it as a priority, the universe of SpaceCraft truly opens up. Because it's no use discovering a system full of resources if you don't have the means to get there alive and return to tell the story. At the beginning, it's very easy to start refining everything you collect without thinking twice. I did exactly that, filling my inventory with materials that seemed useful, but in practice had a very poor return. And then comes that moment when you realize you spent resources, time, and space on things that don't truly push your progress. The turning point happens when you start paying attention to the return ratio of each refinement. Not every resource is worth processing immediately, and some are much more valuable if you save them for unlocks or more advanced crafts. When you start choosing better what to refine, your progression accelerates in an absurd way, because everything starts to yield more. And there is a point here that is simply crucial. Go after the modular systems permit as early as possible. This unlock completely changes the game. It opens access to the shipyard, blueprints, and much more advanced crafting systems. It's the kind of upgrade that doesn't seem urgent at the beginning, but later you realize you should have prioritized it from the first moment. After I adjusted these two things, refining intelligently and focusing on this permit, the beginning of the game became much more fluid. I stopped being stuck in slow progress and started building, improving, and expanding with much more consistency. If you really want to accelerate in SpaceCraft, it's not about farming more, it's about using what you are already collecting better.